All right. All right. So welcome once again to our report launch on systemic barriers and gendered consequences, an Afro-feminist approach to digital public infrastructure in Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Uganda, I believe. Let me just get it right. I'll get it right later. But it's a research that you will hear more about from the panelists. We have Bonaventure Saturday here from Policy, worked on the who worked on the reports, and I'm just looking forward to hearing from them. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists, and I can ask all the speakers to turn on their cameras so that we can see their faces. But we have Josephine Kaniru with us here from CPIT, the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology. She will be our able moderator. Josephine is a research associate at CPIT, where she researches the governance of emerging technologies, including AI, data governance, and government digital services. Her work focuses on how regulatory frameworks and technological design shape participation, accountability, and outcomes within digital ecosystems. And she has researched issues such as data governance for platform workers, AI governance trends in Africa, the regulation of algorithmic management of labor, accessibility and technological exclusion of persons with disability, gender bias in AI chatbots, and risk in automated decision-making systems. So she's very, very qualified to be moderating this conversation. We also have here with us Bonaventure Saturday, who is a research manager at Policy, working on digital rights, gender, justice, data governance, and Afrofeminist digital inclusion in Africa, which is really the crux of these reports across Uganda, South Africa, and Kenya, not Nigeria, sorry. I'm just to Nigerian and it comes out. As a feminist digital rights advocate, he contributes evidence-based perspectives to policy discourse and is committed to advancing inclusive, safe, and rights-respecting digital environments across Africa. Welcome, Bonaventure. We have David Iri. I've been trying to practice the pronunciation of his surname, which I should have just asked. Iri Bagiza. David is a digital rights professional with experience spanning social media strategy, policy advocacy, and the intersection of gender and technology. Through his work at the Women of Uganda Network, he has contributed to initiatives focused on digital inclusion, online safety, and expanding access to technology for women and girls. So it's very fitting that he's also here. Beyond policy and advocacy, he has strong interest in how digital platforms shape everyday experiences. And finally, we have Angela with us, Angela Chukunzira. She has been involved with social movements and their communicative practices in Nairobi. She has also examined the intersection of labor and human rights within the digital economy, specifically with location-based platform workers and the invisible tech workers. She has previously researched on youth perceptions of digitization, unemployment, and what the future of workers looks like. She researches the political economy of technology in Africa. So when I told you that we have a fantastic lineup of speakers, I was not joking. Please use your emojis to put your hands together for these people as I hand over to Josephine.
Thank you, Adeboro, and thank you to everyone who has attended on time, and thank you to also the panelists. So I'll jump right in since we have done the introductions, and I will engage our panelists to tell us about the research. And I'll start with Bonaventure because he was involved, as Adeboro mentioned, in this research project. And first, I just wanted you to set the stage for us. Tell us the why of this project. What gaps and tensions did you see in how digital public infrastructure is being implemented in these countries? What did you set out to address, and what was the why of this project? If you can tell us, thanks.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Once again, my name is Bonaventure and I work in the research department at Policy. And I want to begin by briefly defining what we mean by digital public infrastructure. So these are three foundational systems. One, we mean digital identification. If you're in Uganda, you know what we call Ndangamuntu, or in Kenya, what we call Maisha number, or Smart ID in South Africa. That's digital identification. Now, number two, we mean digital payments, things like mobile money, M-Pesa in Kenya. And then number three, we mean data exchange platforms, that enable people to access services and participate in economic and social life. So in principle, these digital public infrastructure, or what we call DPI, they are designed to expand access, they are designed to improve efficiency and support inclusion. But the starting point of this report was some of the gaps that we realized, whereby much of the current conversation assumes that digitalization automatically leads to inclusion, which is not the case. For example, when you look at digital identification, for you to have a bank account, have a SIM card, to register for any government program, you need an ID. But access to this national ID is not equal due to the requirements to register, due to the documentation gaps, due to the processes for verifying your citizenship. For example, some of the ethnic groups in Kenya, like the Nubians, like some of the Somalis, you have to go an extra effort to prove that you're Kenyan to be able to have an ID. So because of this, digitalization, which we are bringing on board, does not remove these barriers. Instead, it will formalize them and scale exclusion. Number two, when we look at digital payments, so, they're often presented as drivers of financial inclusion, which is a good thing. But participation depends on having identification. For you to be able to engage with digital payment systems, you have to have an ID, a SIM card, you have to have a mobile phone, and you have to have the literacy to know how to use this phone. So this means individuals without IDs are excluded. And as a result, this is reproducing existing inequalities. Thirdly, when you look at data exchange systems, when you're going to register your phone and you put your NIN number, the government shares data from the government side to this other private telecom company. So what are these exchange and laws that are governing the way they are managing this data, accessing this data, and whether individuals are having meaningful control over their personal data? So because of that, because of these key gaps that we identified, we are able to with the support from the African Internet Rights Alliance, that's IRA, we wanted to seek to examine these intersections. So the critical question that we are looking at is whether these systems work, but the critical question is not whether these systems work, but whether they work equitably, whether they are protecting rights, and whether they are building trust among the populations they are meant to serve. So in a nutshell, that's a brief about some of the things that guided us to do this report.
Thank you so much, Bonaventure, also for the definition, so that we know what exactly we're looking at. And now to David, I would want to hear maybe now a bit more about how things are going on the ground. So observing the trajectory of how DPI is being implemented on the continent, what are you observing? How are these services, these DPI-backed services, interacting with people? How are they interacting with women? How are they interacting with other underrepresented groups? David, maybe you can just expand that a bit for us and tell us how that looks like on the ground.
Yes, thank you so much, Josephine, for that question. And I'm glad my colleague Bonaventure did, in detail, first of all, expound more on what we should, understand, DPI to me. And he also went ahead to, give some of what we fear are the risks that have been, associated with the rolling out of, these DPIs across Africa. But just to expound more on, what the current trajectory is like and how it specifically, relates to some of the underrepresented groups. And you make quite a great mention of some of these groups. You made mention of women and girls. You made mention of the ethnic minorities. Bonaventure did actually even highlight some of the ethnic minorities that also do fall under the marginalized or the underrepresented groups. So one of the biggest fears about DPI is how exactly it is, outpacing, inclusion and human rights safeguards. Why am I saying this? Quite a number of, digital systems, be it the digital ID systems, be it the mobile, payments. I could talk about the tax payment systems in Uganda for those of you who might know the IFRI systems and the likes, and of course, and other integrated, service platforms in so many other sectors that have been rolled out by the government. We notice the fact that most of these have largely been driven, like Bonaventure did make mention of, uh, behind what they coin as, efficiency. They speak of economic growth. They speak of, you know, modernization of, state departments and all. But all this is being done again without taking into consideration aspects of inclusion. And these this is something that we feel has been, quite lagging behind, especially when it comes to the fact, for example, I could make mention of women and girls, whom women of Uganda Network does deal, quite a lot with, who already are facing the problem of, the gender digital divide, where we've witnessed that there are quite a number of women and girls who are not in a position to enjoy the usage of, this digital technology as compared to their male counterparts. Now, this leaves them at a position where they're not in a position to use some of these digital systems, but then the government will continue, to brag about how these DPIs are meant for economic growth, but what is growth when it is excluding some of these people? But then I also want to highlight the fact that, again, these digital systems also risk, again, excluding the most vulnerable. And by this, I mean, even amongst these groups of vulnerabilities that we've talked about, the women, the ethnic, minorities and all. Again, amongst them, you can't also generalize. We have to further interrogate these groups of people. Why am I saying that? I'm speaking about persons like the elderly. If we have maybe women and girls, are we looking at also those that are best in the rural context? The mere fact that, for example, if you are from Uganda, as you sway away from the city center, which is Kampala, and head into most of those remote areas, access to internet keeps dwindling. And I'm talking about fast and reliable internet. But then remember, most of these DPIs actually do rely on, for example, the internet. But now what happens when some of these groups are being left out? I'm talking about the elderly. For example, these uh, elderly women who are not, they're perhaps registering people to get their national IDs, as Bonaventure did make mention, down Muntu. That is what he did refer to it as in Uganda. So what happens? Because this is going to be the basis on which they're actually going to, access quite a number of, services in Uganda. But then again, there is also the design bias, and then when they are trying to come up with some of these DPIs, not put this into consideration, whereby you are coming up with these systems and then aspects of inclusion also on gender
David, I'm sorry, I think you're breaking up a bit.
coming in the Athens to explore. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we missed a bit of what you said at the end.
Can I be heard? Just confirm.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Okay. So the point. Okay, perfect. So the point I was trying to make at the very end is the fact that the design, again, of some of these systems, again, lacks that gender perspective, whereby they mostly do bring in the gender perspective in the aftermath when they have already deployed these systems. They're using complete data sets that not reflect the gendered realities, of these women and girls. And therefore, it is the reason why you discover that most of these systems are, in actual sense, not benefiting some of these, marginalized groups. Like I said, what is growth if this growth is going to exclude some? And then again, we expose these women and girls, to certain risks, and these are risks that also might include, for example, surveillance, and because we have seen some of these systems we have seen in Uganda. We have the smart city, program that was also being rolled out by the government. We have the Nangamuntu system, which is the identification system again, which all in all give access to the government, about certain information that is private information about people, whereby the government is in a position to know who you are. It knows your date of birth, it knows where you stay, it knows who your relatives are, and all these, bring about that exposure to data breaches. And in addition to that, it also does enable state and institutional surveillance, which again puts these women and girls at risk. Yeah. For now, I will just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to both yourself, David, and Bonaventure for setting that stage. And Angela, from what I'm hearing them say, they are defining what was found in what the report found, what the research found, which is that most of these systems are designed to be very state-centric, right? So it's about efficiency, benefits, and adopting technology, but there's no citizen centricity. There's no consideration of how are the people interacting with this system. So from what they have said, if you could first paint a picture for us, what does that look like? What does citizen-centric digital public services look like? And then tell us in Kenya, what have you seen that look like? Is there any attempt to achieve citizen centricity? Just any thoughts you can add to what they have said.
Thanks. I don't know if you noticed the entire time Bonaventure and David were talking, I was just nodding my head because I was like, wow, I completely agree with everything that they're saying. And when you think about how digital public infrastructure is set up, it's completely, it's when I see how it's created and how it's made, it's for the state and not for the citizen. And so how do you imagine something that you've never seen? It's also I'm just taking back the question to you because it's about how do you dream of something that has never been visualized in your reality. You've never been included anywhere. You've never thought about how your reality is perceived in a certain space. That's why there's always this question of we must actually see ourselves as represented. Then once we see ourselves represented, we can imagine we can be included. But what happens when you've never seen yourself? There's a limitation. Your dream is always limited by your environment and your reality. So in terms of a digital public infrastructure that looks like a utopia, when I try to paint that picture for myself and for the country that I live in, that is Kenya, it's something that, ever since the digitization boom started in Kenya, when it was like, when you think when Uhuru and Ruto were taking power in 2013, their whole campaign was around tunatoka, we're leaving analog, we're getting into the digital space. So that whole thinking of, and it was sort of like a utopia, because I was like, when they're saying we're leaving the analog and we're going into the digital, what does it look like? It looked like surveillance. And that is what I'm saying. That it looked like surveillance, exactly. And that is what I'm saying. This is why it is states that when you think of the state centering itself, it looked like surveillance. And even that campaign in 2013 itself was actually aided by public relations firms that were external, like Cambridge Analytica, that looked at people's Facebook data, and so that creates mistrust, right? And so when you think of how digital public infrastructure is shaped at the moment, it's top down rather than participatory. So it's something that's shoved down our throat, like, oh, you need a Huduma number or a Maisha number, or yeah, or even inevitably as a foreigner, I'm talking about a friend's experience who came to Kenya, and she was like, oh, I actually need a SIM card because everything is paid by M-Pesa. So it's something that almost shoved down your throat inevitably, and you need to adjust to this. So DPIs are not co-designed by communities, by grassroots organizations, by people themselves, by civil society organization, but it's always something that's shoved down our throats. And that's why I'm saying it's state-centric. And also, on the other hand, when you think of DPS, for example, how we are paying taxes, right? There's this Kenya Revenue Authority portal where people are now told, like, oh, you just need to put in your ID number and get a password, and that's how you'll pay. So it's actually design driven by state goals. It's never thought about, like, what do people actually need? It's like, oh, we need to collect revenue, and everyone needs to register. So they have your number, they put your number in there, and they're like, oh, even money that comes in through your mobile payment should be counted as revenue. And I'm like, how is that even possible when people pay money all the time? You pay your security bills, you pay your rent through M-Pesa. So what does it mean when money is flowing through my M-Pesa? That counts as income, you know? And another thing is that there's and David and Bonaventure have already mentioned and touched on it, is like, this is actually something that is mandatory enrollment without the citizen consenting to it. So it's like, oh, the government is rolling out a project where we will have digital IDs, So if you don't have a digital ID, that's the end. You can't access taxes, you can't access government services, you can't access affordable housing or any other thing that it is. So we're not being included. So and it stems from the first point that I was raising, that it's really about design that is driven by administrative goals of the state. So the state wants to accomplish this, and so they will shove it down your throat like this. And then also another thing that has happened, maybe we didn't have foresight on the issue, was that when people are signing up for when people are using digital public infrastructure, people are actually using it for a certain purpose, and then the purpose is somehow shifted. For example, you're using mobile money transfers to be able to pay your bus fare, to be able to buy your groceries or whatever it is, just mundane everyday things, or send money home. And then what happens is that it becomes a surveillance point. That is what determines if you'll get a loan or not. Because they're seeing how your expenditure is from there. And then they're like, we actually don't need your bank statements anymore. We actually need your M-Pesa statements, because that talks about your everyday spending more than anything. And also that becomes a surveillance tool, because this is how your life is lived daily. From day to day, your life is lived through these exchanges on the mobile app, or on the exchange of money. And so it unintentionally becomes a surveillance tool. And I remember during the 2024 protests, people were being arrested, arbitrary arrests of the youth. And somehow this was because of just their phone number, and because you're able to verify this is someone's number, these are their financial transactions, or this is how your phone number in Kenya, as because of the spread of fintech and the use of mobile money, it has almost become your identity. It's your identity. And so that brings to the problem of mistrust and people not being able to trust digital public infrastructures, because you're like, okay, they're sending, when even when researchers are doing research, they're like, are you trying to get to me, to get to the KRA, to get to the revenue authorities so that I'm able to pay taxes or not? Like when you think of workers, and then also there's of course, the exclusion of marginalized groups. When you think, and Bonaventure and David have already mentioned, like with the Nubian population, for instance, where you always need your ID, you always, and there's like, oh, because your grandfather didn't have an ID, sometimes you need your mom's ID to apply for your own ID, and your father and your mother don't have IDs. What does that look like for you? Yet you were born here, you've been raised here. This is all you know. So the need to have legal documentation to enroll in most of these DPIs. So if you don't have an ID, you can't get a SIM card, you can't get M-Pesa, you can't access, so it's almost like a trickle down effect for everything that you've been doing. So I'm very grateful that David mentioned particularly the elderly, who are a group that is actually excluded, not only because of maybe lack of the digital ID, the ID itself, but also literacy. Literacy itself takes them away from it. And so, and the rural population specifically, when you're thinking of how digital public infrastructure is created and it's shared and it's disseminates, it's actually from the urban areas into the rural. And so there's always the issue of access and how are people, how are people able to get to these issues down to the core. And then also data governance almost favors the state entirely. Data governance, when you think of legislation, it's made by the state, it's the legislatures that actually, in the executive wing of the state. And so when you see how data governance, and people cannot even grieve, like for instance, if you're a trans person, you changed your gender from you are born biologically female and then you're now male, what happens? It almost becomes entirely on you, and it becomes a big problem. Sometimes you always have these issues when you're trying to change your documentation, and you're trying to think of what does my documentation look like. So, I'm glad that some of those things have come out very clearly in the report. That when you're thinking about feminist data governance, when you're thinking of feminist DPIs, when you're thinking of how we're to develop them as feminists, these are some of the issues that are very critical to think about in terms of, you can't just have the binary of sex, it's male and female. We need to expand it beyond for other people who are excluded within this kind of identities. And maybe I can stop at that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was really good context for what the previous speakers had told us. So just maybe a quick follow-up. So you said it's not easy to paint a picture of what a citizen-centered DPI adoption looks like. I'm still curious if we have any thoughts in terms of even what we see currently, because something I think David mentioned is that we deploy systems and then we start, course correcting and making corrections and embedding inclusion at the end, and maybe having appeals mechanisms where people can appeal, and then there's inclusion after the fact. So maybe with the systems that have already been released, do you see any opportunity to embed inclusion? Where can corrections be made? And this is open to yourself, to Bonaventure, and also to David. Where can corrections be made, even in the systems that have already been deployed? What citizen-centric principles maybe and actions can we take?
I mean, I'm not entirely pessimistic to the point that these systems can change and should be challenged, because they already exist. And I don't want us to think of reinventing the wheel, etc. But for me, I'm like, issues like gender and that fluidity should be included, right? And people who have been marginally excluded, when you think of the Nubian population, you think of Somalis, we need to actually say, if your father or mother does not have ID, as long as you were born in Kenya, as long as you can, there needs to be some flexibility. And also another issue for me would be like the issue of redress. Like if my data was breached, how can my problems be, how can my, what does it mean? How can my grievances be heard? And that will also build a lot of trust within the citizenry in terms of when people are collecting data like this and I need to correct some issues, is there possibility to redress some of them, and I think for me that would be the starting point. And then we can start imagining like we are actually being heard, we are actually being included in these spaces and in these conversations. I leave for the other speakers to contribute.
David, Bonaventure, anything to add on that?
Thank you very much. Me, I would argue it around affordability to be respected as a rights issue, not just a consumer issue. In an inclusive, all feminist DPI, access would not depend on whether someone can afford a smartphone or has constant data or are going to an agent. Services should be designed for low bandwidth. They should be designed to have offline and assisted use. They should have multiple languages and should be able to be used on ordinary services. When you look at South Africa, for instance, they have a Mzansi roadmap, and it already points out to zero rating. When I say zero rating, I mean a practice where internet service providers or mobile carriers do not charge users for data consumed by specific websites. For instance, if you're in Uganda and use MTN, you can use their app without, even if you don't have data, you're able to use that. So as a government, what are some of these platforms we can able to use without even incurring costs, because already the costs are very high? So I know Uganda's roadmap is also setting out some ambitious, connectivity and e-service access targets, but the feminist test remains. It's whether the low-income woman down there, the rural user, and other excluded groups can be able to actively use these services in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Yes.
David. Mhm.
Yes, thank you so much. I also just wanted to add something small, and I also do agree with my colleague when she also does make mention of the fact that sometimes when the defect is incurable, the only thing that is right to do is actually get rid of whatever DPI or whatever system that is. And I believe sometimes it can be maybe through strategic litigation whereby you present such a case to courts of law, and then they have their say about it, and mostly from a human rights perspective. But also I also can't disregard the fact that in certain instances maybe a few things can be done to improve the quality of service and the kind of inclusivity that is being propagated by some of these DPIs. I'll give a case, for example, like if it is something to do with like language, for example, that not everyone might be in a position to, be comfortable with communicating in the King's language. In that instance, for example, isn't it possible to localize some of these uh, let's say, for example, the tax payment sites that had earlier on made mention of, is it possible maybe to have some of this data, some of this information being translated into local languages that people can very well understood? Bonaventure did make mention of things to do with, internet access in terms of affordability. But even then, we maybe have some, some basic digital literacy, uh, you know, uh, capacity building or trainings going on in some of these societies to make sure that at the end of the day, they are for the good of the most marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. So something else that was mentioned was that inclusion also includes acknowledging that not everyone wants to be digitized. I think that's something you alluded to, Angela, and I'm very curious about that. And so to just take this to Bonaventure, so beyond access, let's assume we're now in that utopia that Angela was mentioning, and access is not an issue. I want you to just tell us now about the experiences on these digital systems, especially from a gendered perspective. So even if maybe let's say we are not talking about the women who can't access, say, we mentioned women in rural areas, women who are of older age, women who are facing maybe a literacy barrier, even the women who have all the advantages in that regard, right? So they can access the systems. I wonder what their experiences look like, and not just women now, all the marginalized and underrepresented groups, once they have access, once we assume that we've achieved, some of our desires and they have access, what specific tensions do they face in terms of experience, in terms of experiencing these systems and how they are designed? And I think this will just take us back to how we are saying that they are designed with the state in mind. Because if you're designing it for the people, you'll consider that you have different genders, different socioeconomic status. You'll have all the context of the people going to access the system. But if you're just designing it for the state and to collect money or those other purposes, then it's very linear, right? It's not very multi-contextual. So I just want to hear from you what the experiences look like for the different underrepresented groups. And if you could mention just a bit about people with disabilities and what challenges they might also face even once they have, let's assume they have access to the systems. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josephine. So, well, it's among the key findings that we found out. First of all, I want to talk about it in a few dimensions. When you look at, even if we are in a utopia, as you said, the woman has access and all that, but the patriarchy, social norms, cultural expectations, gender roles are still existing in the societies. So this will affect the way this woman is accessing this platform. In many contexts, in Uganda, Kenya, and many other African countries, you find cultural expectations are positioning women primarily as caregivers and primarily as homemakers. So you find they are still having issues to do with limited control over their financial and technological resources. So still affecting the way they are engaging, all the time they have to engage with these digital systems and autonomy in making decisions. You also mentioned something around people with disabilities. The other day I was having a discussion with someone with a low vision. When you go to a website and they want you to prove you're a human, they will give you to do some ladders and some stairs. So imagine someone with a low vision, how will they do the stairs and prove they are human? So you find the system is kicking out because of the way they are. So you find many of these systems are being designed for efficiency, yes, which is a good thing. But as David has mentioned, the other add-ons, the other accessibility options come as later stage as an add-on after feedback. Yet it should be, first of all, at the foundational design step. This should be very, very key. Then the other issue that affects this woman from accessing, we have what we call authoritarian practices, these authoritarian practices where we have issues to do with internet shutdowns, issues to do with online surveillance, the way Angela had shared earlier. So you find even if you have access, the internet will be off. You're not able to make payment to your business or something. So I find because of this, especially in politically sensitive movements, all moments you find due to internet shutdowns, the women are not able to access these digital services because of the surveillance. Okay, you find they're also fearing to engage with these digital platforms. So, in a nutshell, I think we should be able to have, inclusive and feminist DPI ecosystems in Africa, where women do not need to surrender their privacy. They need to have where the state cannot quite repurpose the infrastructure to watch the citizens, to patch the citizens, or even silence the people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I like what you've shown us that, and I really just wanted that to come out clear that access is not the only issue that underrepresented groups face. Even once they have access, then there's other challenges that come out. And thank you for mentioning internet shutdowns and how that affects different groups. And also that example about, are you a robot? That's a really good example, because a website might have all the accessibility measures, right, to make sure that your friend can see, but when they have to prove that they're human, then they face a barrier. And if we were to design every tool, including the Are You a Robot tool, the capture tools, with that in mind, with the inclusion in mind, then it will be easier to design very inclusive products. So thank you for that. Now to David, I wanted to maybe for you to tell us how the conversation we are having is interacting with other internet governance aspects in general, maybe data governance. Someone I think mentioned something about data and how we govern data and how that interacts with DPI, for example. There's a lot of conversations on AI governance. I'm sure that conversation still, affects what we are discussing here today, because even a lot of the services being released, in digital public infrastructure, there's also AI features that are being embedded in the system. So, David, if you could tell us that interaction between digital public infrastructure and generally what conversations are going on in terms of data governance, internet governance, control, and how that's going on the continent. Maybe you can also contextualize that for us with Uganda and how that looks like. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much for that question. Of course, I just want us to firstly acknowledge the fact that, these systems, these DPIs, have become centralized data systems. And all these, of course, have been integrated into, service delivery systems as well. And the moment that happens, it is then bound to rub shoulders with areas around digital rights, areas to do with governance, and as well as control. And the first point that I'm going to make in that regard is again that uh, when we again have weak data governance frameworks, it is bound to increase the kinds of risks that we are going to face with these DPIs. That whereas, for example, we have, most of our nations actually might have one or two, data protection laws. The challenge again therein lies in issues like, for example, the weak enforcement when it comes to some of these data laws. That most of our nations in Africa, we do have these policies, but they are just policies on paper. When it comes to implementation, sometimes it's quite lacking. And maybe just to further contextualize this, I just wanted to give, for example, an example of Uganda, where we have the Personal Data Protection Office. It's one, I commend them for the fact that they have done, one or two things here and there to, protect personal data. But then we still have, I think, a lot to do. And I remember a very interesting scenario where one of the popular, human rights activists, known as Dr. Sarah Virete, was recently around the general elections, arrested and, charged before court on account of the fact that she had access, unauthorized access to personal data, and this was more so data to do with electoral details of people. And guess who was, claiming that she had unauthorized access to this information? It was the Electoral Commission of Uganda. And guess what? When we did check the registry of the personal data protection, where it is mandatory that if you're going to be a data collector, that ideally you are supposed to be registered with this office. Guess which office wasn't registered with the PDPO? It was the Electoral Commission again. So again, there comes in, instances of weak enforcement, but then that also can't be, dealt away without paying attention to, again, limited institutional capacity when it comes to issues to do with data governance. The mere fact that we have quite a number of people that in charge of this data that is being accessed through some of these systems, and they are not in a position to know how they are supposed to handle this data. When can they use it? When can they not use it? And the mere fact that they should always use this data with the permission of the data subjects. But also, we also can't ignore the fact that again, the more we have, these DPIs, and depending on who exactly is behind the development of these DPIs, we are likely to see, influence peddling, and that comes, in the case of the private sector that might, be in partnerships with the government when it comes to the development and deployment of some of these systems. The mere fact that depending on what their country of origin's, interest is, most of the times this is what is exactly going to manifest in the kinds of systems that they're actually building for you and deploying. But then I also can't ignore the fact that one way or the other, these DPIs are also, going to increase the risk of, civic space shrinking, and democratic participation as well will, in most cases, shrink. This is because, again, the information that is being attained through this digital public infrastructure is, again, information that can be used by some authoritarian states, to target, for example, human rights activists, because this is information that can be used, for example, to track where they live, to track who they talk to on a daily, to know who their family is, and then they're at a risk of being targeted for some of the opinions that they may be having about the issues that do affect the people. So just to sum it up, I think what we are exactly witnessing is, a shift where digital systems are not just enabling governance, but they are also, in one way or the other, redefining power, control, and participation in most of these digital spaces. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And yeah, actually, to recap a bit, also Angela had mentioned what you just said, which is that even the civic space is at a risk of shrinking further. And she gave an example of, during the protests in Kenya, how data as simple or as unassuming as your phone number was used to track a lot of people, and that led to arrest. I also appreciate what you mentioned about the fact that even if we have data protection laws, enforcement is another whole story. And I think enforcement capacity needs to really be increased, so that, and also the regulators, need to be independent and to be able to enforce the law, so that, they can protect citizen rights. Because often it's the case that the violator of these rights, as with the example you just gave, is often government institutions, right? Right. So yeah, I think that's a really good example. So Angela, I'm going to pressure you to paint for us that picture again about utopia. I know we had a bit of a discussion about this when this came up earlier, but I think maybe I'll make it sound like a brainstorm. We can just brainstorm. What does that utopia look like? I think when Bonaventure was speaking about access versus the experiences, even after you've had access, we noted that access is not the only issue, right? So we can paint what access looks like. What the utopia looks like with regard to access, where everyone, we have accessibility measures on these systems. Where the people who cannot access the services digitally can at least access them, in the real world. All the barriers have been removed. In terms of experience, how does that utopia look like? How do we make sure that every person's, wellness and well-being and care is actually embedded in services? Because I think I understand when you say it's very difficult to imagine, but there's a dream, right? There's a dream you have. What does that look like? And also, as you take this up, I wanted to remind the attendees, you can share your thoughts in the chat. You can share your thoughts, share your questions. We are going to engage with that. Angela?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Josephine, for pushing me to really work on this very difficult task. In terms of utopia, I think Bonaventure had already mentioned some things like using a USSD code. You can use a feature phone. You cannot have a smartphone. What does it mean to think of capture as for people who are visually impaired? What does I had mentioned it before. What does it look like for queer people, gender non-conforming people to be able to be included in these systems? But at the same time, I think when you're even creating the utopia, of what this thing looks like, the core of it is really citizen participation through this process. Because without that, then what utopia we create, we're creating something that is for people who do not want it, or what is it that you need at the core of your needs? When we're saying we want to collect taxes online, and you need to be able to file your tax returns, your annual tax returns online. What does it mean? Like, what need is it serving for the people? I think that should be the primary question for the state, and also for the citizenry to be active on pushing this agenda, because I've seen much more recently, maybe one thing that I would maybe applaud and looks like utopia to me is when people are now saying that there's a campaign on voter registration, hashtag Nikokadi. And I'm starting to see people are using that as evidence and taking screenshots that I'm actually a registered voter. That looks like, it paints a picture of utopia where people are feeling this is how I can be included. And actually, there's also citizen education, not only people saying that I'm actually a registered voter and I can prove that because I can go online and to the website portal and see like my registration voter details, but also voter education on the ground. So also educating people on the need for why is this important? Why do we need to do this? I think that's really paints a much more utopic picture, and we can see as an example. I can paint it as an example for now, like when people are saying they want to register for being voted, and to prove it you have to go to the portal and to be able to capture your details and be like, oh, actually on the voting day this is what I will show to the officers. So, and people educating each other, peer-to-peer learning. This is not actually education coming from the state. In fact, it's young people educating other people. Organizations like Siasa Place are doing that, and people, all these campaigns that are coming up. And this paints, to me, like, it paints a hopeful future ahead. Like, peer-to-peer learning is important for us to see we are actually benefiting from being included in this system. Maybe that was what I would point out before we leave it to the audience.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that. And as you were speaking, I also remember, especially with the campaign you have given as an example. So for those who are not Kenyan, it's as Angela mentioned, it's hashtag Nikokadi, which means I have my voter's card. There's more context to it, but basically I have my voter's card. And someone was asking me, could this also be used as a tool to force transparency, right? So as soon as I have my screenshot showing that I'm a registered voter, right, and we know there's often a lot of manipulation of these systems, can we use that as evidence to make sure that the state doesn't do any form of, back end manipulation? That I have proof that I registered, and at some point I had proof that I'm a registered voter. So I think that's also something very interesting to think about, because transparency, I think, is something else that comes up comes across in a lot of research around DPI is, and I think this has come up in this conversation, we often don't even know the companies that have been, commissioned to, for example, to provide the systems. We don't know the company, we don't know the deployment process, we don't know anything, we don't know whether they did a data protection impact assessment and maybe realized there were some risks but decided to ignore the risk. We often don't know. And citizens are just told at the end, you have to register for this. If you don't, you're not going to receive certain services. So I think transparency is also something else that we'll keep looking out for. And thank you for that picture, Angela, of utopia. I think, it's something we can replicate in other contexts. So that's good to point that out. Now, my final question goes to Bonaventure. And in the meantime, remember you can have your questions on the chat and we're going to respond to them. So Bonaventure, yours is also going to be a bit about the utopia, but I won't give you, a 100-year timeline. In the next 5 to 10 years or so, what do you see happening based on the research that you have done and what you found out in terms of what CSOs are doing on the ground, what academia is doing on the ground, how governments are responding, whether they're actually responding to the criticism. Based on all that, in the next, 1 decade, how do you think that the DPI systems are going to look like? Are they going to be different? And are they going to embed feminist principles? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I think the future is promising because I see a number of African countries are already building the foundations. I see a number of civil society organizations, for instance, policy. We are doing a lot of digital literacy trainings for women and other groups of people. And I wanted to share something very important from our report for the case of South Africa, which is leading, especially in Africa in digital transformation. So they have my Muzanzi roadmap, okay? So it's an approach where no one is left behind and it adopts the UNDP DPI standards. And this is providing an entry point for the stronger rights-based approach. But they have a persona. So they have a persona on their my Muzanzi roadmap that shows how a woman is accessing digital services before the transformation and how this woman is accessing the services after the transformation. Now, what we found out is that interestingly, this my Mzanzi persona, they call the persona fictional user, they call the user Thandi. So interestingly, Thandi assumes that Thandi is urban, it assumes that Thandi is literate, and assumes Thandi has a phone and internet. So this leaves out the rural women out there with low literacy skills with low cost. So if a government already designing is assuming people are literate, people are having phones, there's a problem. So now I keep asking myself from a feminist, DPI ecosystem, what if Thand is rural? What if Thand shares a phone with her sister to access the services? What if she's faced with domestic violence or things like that? What if she's disabled? So in other words, as we design these systems, we should look at these margins from the start. We don't add them later on as an accessibility part or something. So much as there are these issues, the future is promising and the evidence we are seeing it's suggesting that without deliberate attention to gender, without deliberate attention to affordability, literacy, and inclusive design, DPI will still risk reinforcing the existing inequalities rather than addressing them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I just want to say thank you to the panelists for the perspectives, and I'm sure you've jogged the minds of our participants, and they have quite a bit to maybe contribute or ask questions. So I want to open it up to the floor, to the room. If you have any questions or contributions, or something you have found in your research that maybe our panelists have, do not have that context, you can also share that with us. Yeah, so I'm taking us to that session where we can share perspectives. You can just raise your hand or unmute your mic and speak up. Yvonne?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the very excellent presentation. I've learned so much. Well, I'm just curious to find that, I guess, specific things from this research finding that you like to share with us. I think for many of the...
Yvonne, I'm so sorry. You're not so clear. If you could speak a bit louder.
Okay, so I was just saying that it's been a great presentation so far. I have learned a lot. Can you hear me? Yeah, but I'm just curious to find out, what were the basic findings in this research that you'd like to share with us specific to each of the countries? If you were to say one thing that jumped out from this research from each of the countries, what would that be?
Okay, so if I got that right, Yvonne is asking what's your main takeaway? What's the main thing that you found out in this research? I hope I got that right, Yvonne.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that's much better, yes.
Okay, so I think it's my headphone. So I was just saying great presentation. I've learned so much, but curious to find out what were the specific findings, maybe in one sentence or two. Yes. For each of the countries they've spoken about in respect of topics that we are discussing.
All right, thank you. Maybe the panelists will take that. Let's take all the questions and then you guys can answer. So any other question? Thanks, Yvonne, for that. Another question? Comments? It doesn't have to be a question. Input maybe from your research, especially for the countries that have not been discussed. You can tell us the perspectives from those countries. Annex?
Thank you so much, Josephine. And thank you so much to all the speakers. Very informative session, I must say. My name is Annex Kemanzi, and I work with policy under the programs team. And one thing that I think I can confirm from the different systems that are usually set by the government to either with the intention of simplifying or even breaking down certain processes to make it easy so that citizens can be able to get services, is the fact that I think a very good example of how that has hit me during the discussion is before I joined the civil society, I used to work for a law firm, and I will admit that most of the work that we actually used to do was not more so about the legal bit, but was trying to help people access services, government services within the different infrastructure that they've set. And this, of course, brings up a lot of online systems. And most of our work was to easily get someone an appointment just because you're logging in, you're asking them their information, and you're helping them. And that is, unfortunately, that is how we used to make money for 40% of the time as a law firm. And this calls for how unrealistic the different systems are set for a layman. This could even be a man or a woman. And of course, even being more of a disadvantage for the women, because according to the Uganda reports, with the 11.9 million Ugandans, 7.3 of them are women who are illiterate or have not gone to school, or at least at a certain level, meaning it's going to even be worse. In general, most of our clients were men, because men are the ones who usually access these services, who would want to register businesses, transfer land, get passports, things like that, meaning that the women are not even yet in the space of wanting to access these different services. So this calls for, if a 1 or 2% of them would want to, meaning chances are they may not even be able to afford us as a law firm to help them access these services or be able to access these different services. So a lot of the discussion was pointing out to why this is actually possible, because unfortunately for Uganda, I'll speak for Uganda because I'm Uganda, is the fact that most of the systems that the government sets or within the different infrastructure, there's usually a middleman, which I think removes the intention of it being easy for people or citizens to access these different services. So where does that leave a woman who, the 1% would want to get a passport? There's so many services that we used to render for those who want to. It's basically going online, putting in their different personal information, and then getting an appointment before they go to physically to the office. But even just that was hard for a woman who has never used a computer, because most of these services cannot be done on a phone, but on a computer or a PC or something. So this in itself is eliminating them, meaning they'll have to have some sort of extra cost to have someone to help them make an appointment. So this discussion was really very informative in that sense, but then also pointing out the need for inclusive systems again as a government, and I think as Africa, as Ugandans, this is something that is usually thought of later on when a project or when an initiative has already been launched. That is when they try to bring in the gender bit, and I think it's important for us to continue advocating for inclusion within the different minority groups, within women, so that, because most of the time, this is where, if it's affecting the general community, then it's even worse for the women. So that is my submission. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Annex. That's really, really good perspective. And that exposed an extra barrier, I think. The idea that most of these systems require a middleman for people who are intended to receive them very easily to actually receive them. And that obviously also raises some data protection concerns. So, if you as the law firm have to I'll give the Kenyan example. So I'm sure there's the law firms, but the middlemen in a lot of Kenya, in a lot of the Kenyan case in terms of accessing these services is usually cyber cafes, right? So there's someone who's usually they have a lot of computers, and then they open the portal for you. They, if you're maybe applying for a higher education loan, they'll do that application for you. Even we talked about women, older women, especially in rural areas. You see a lot of these women will go to the cyber cafe to have someone, open the portal and maybe even receive the funds on their behalf, or at least set up the phone number that will be receiving the funds. There's a lot of room there for exploitation and for privacy violation. So thank you for that perspective. We will take another question from Neema Mujesia.
Thank you, Josephine. My name is Naima Mjisia from Kiktanet. I'm the communication advisor. And my question really is on who holds the power in shaping the DPIs in Africa. I'm always curious about that because I've attended so many meaningful conversations in regards to this discussion, and I'm always wondering who holds this power. And another question that I have is, in light of what Annex has presented, is how can we be able to put into design gender consideration, especially for the minorities, when it comes to a DPI infrastructure in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neema. These are really good questions. Before someone else raises their hands, maybe our panelists can take those two questions and maybe also comment on Annex's statement. I won't assign, I'll just leave it open. So the panelists, you can take any of the questions. If you didn't get any of them clear, I can tell you the questions. But there was the question from Yvonne on the findings, the main findings, especially on each country. And then there's the questions from Neema, especially on who holds the power, and then the gender, how to embed gender consideration. And then, yeah, if you can also just comment a bit on Annex's comments.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I think I will start by an important question from Yvonne around the key findings from each country. Well, interestingly, there were many cross-cutting findings we found from each country, but specifically when you go to Uganda, for example, we have the Registration of Persons Act, which mandates that for you to access SIM card, for you to have a bank account and some other government program, you have to have a national ID. So the challenge in Uganda is that exclusion is at the point of registration, which translates into dicto inclusion. Dicto exclusion. And interestingly, in these three countries, it is only Uganda that has had internet shutdowns during elections. And of course, these have shaped, the public perceptions of these dicto systems. And, the findings we see suggest that this creates some kind of hesitation in fully engaging with the digital platforms. Then when you go to Kenya, Kenya has a slightly different picture because it has an advanced digital ecosystem when it comes to digital payments or mobile money payments. If you have been to Nairobi, it's a challenge to transact with cash, actually. You have to have M-Pesa, for example. So M-Pesa has significantly expanded access to these services. But of course, inclusion is still even. We found that, for example, you find in a family in a rural area having one phone. So for you to send money to your grandfather or mother in the village, you have to send one phone. And it's the man who is having the phone. So actually, the woman not actually receive the money. And interestingly, we found that what women are doing in these rural areas, they are coming together and forming what we call chamas, or some saving groups, or nigina if you're in Uganda, trying to come together and have some kind of financial dependence. Then when you come to South Africa, for it was more, it has a more institutionally developed system, which has some stronger legal protections, including the Protection of Personal Information Act. So, however, as I mentioned, the design assumes an ideal user who already has access to phones, access to internet, as I mentioned, the other as a persona. So those are some of the key things we are a bit listing for each case country, but otherwise the other issues of digital literacy, patriarchy, and the rest, as we have discussed, we are cutting across. I don't know if anyone wants to take another question.
It's okay. It's okay. I can. I wanted to make a response one in regards to who holds the power. I think one of the biggest stamps in our constitution, the Constitution of the Republic of Uganda, is that power belongs to the people and that the government is only exercising it on their behalf. The honest truth is that would only make sense if the manner in which they are exercising it does reflect your views and aspirations. But then, as you might have noticed in the previous discussions, that most of the times, for example, we were talking about some of these marginalized groups, the underserved communities. We are talking about the refugees. We are talking about the ethnic minorities. We are talking about some of these women and girls. These are people who are being, excluded from the enjoyment of some of these DPIs. How then would you say that that is power that is being exercised on their behalf? So for me, in my opinion, the people that are deploying this technology, the people that are building it, and in most cases, of course, that is the government, through several contractors, are the ones that eventually hold the power. And you might also not want to ignore the fact that also the countries and some of the nations that some of these tech builders are also hailing from also do have a degree of power that they are controlling. And then the other question, I think, still from Neema was in regards to how best can we, make this gender, a consideration while we are developing these DPIs. Again, just like I had mentioned, when it comes to the power structure, when it comes to who controls DPI, there is, I think, now a wealth of research. There's a wealth of, studies around issues to do with the exclusion of some of these, minorities when it comes to the enjoyment of some of these digital technologies, and in this case, DPIs. So for them again to pay a blind eye when they are considering when they are building some of these systems is again how some for example these women and girls end up being left out. So for me, in my opinion, what I think they need to do is co-create these DPIs with some of the people that this is meant to benefit. For example, you've heard that most of these women and girls perhaps are not in a position to, claim that they are literate. what interventions do you have in place to ensure that even those that are illiterate perhaps can get some basic digital literacy skills to be in a position maybe to know how to use a tax filing system so that they can have meaningful contribution towards the country's economic growth? Thank you.
I think for me, it will just be to add on to what my colleagues have talked about, but maybe to also mention the issue of tech sovereignty is very important when you're building digital public infrastructures, because this is now where, when you're thinking of the entire power matrix and how it can be used against you or how it can be repurposed and shipped into something else, just the fact that something exists, my phone number exists in one domain doesn't mean that it will affect my political campaign if that's what I'm aspiring to, so tech sovereignty should be something that should be centralized when you're thinking of building digital public infrastructures. And, the role of the state should be working in collaboration with the citizen. As David mentioned, co-creation is key. Participation is key from the entire process. And we're thinking about this even in terms of AI. There's all these new AI policies across the continent. Where are the people? Participatory AI is important. Participation of the citizenry is important for us to build trust, for us to want to even feel like we've been included in the process of building these DPIs and deployment, etc. So that is just what I conclude by. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And Annex shared something very, very important about intermediaries. They're often overlooked, yet they are very, very central actually on how people express digital public infrastructure. When I mention intermediaries, I'm meaning people who sit between the system and the user, like cyber cafe people, brokers, or informal digital assistants, who help people to register for IDs, access these services. Yes, we found out that they are good. They enable people to access the services. Yes, that's good. However, on the other hand, they introduce new risks and power dynamics. One, financial exploitation. You find they're very expensive. They are charging people very expensively. And interestingly, from the literature, we found that actually 43% of Kenyans who have IDs have blind to get IDs. Can you imagine? I don't know how the situation is in your country, but people are blind to have access to this. You can imagine. So this is very, very important. Secondly, there is a risk of privacy and data misuse. You go to an internet cafe and you find a page open of someone who's just been using. You have given all your information to this person. You don't know how they will use it, how they protect all that. So this is something very, very important. And of course, our findings suggest that these intermediaries should not be treated as informal or temporary fixes. They are part of the infrastructure at the design phase. Let's think, for me to get an ID, will a citizen need an intermediary or not? So how am I as a government going to design an inclusive DPI? Thank you.
Yes, and maybe just to add one small thing, Angela did talk about the participatory approach, and it did remind me of the fact that, currently Uganda is trying to, through the Uganda Communications Commission, it is trying to, come up with an AI strategy. I think, yes, even the Ministry of ICT is also involved in that. And they recently rolled out, a form through which form you are in a position to actually make your contribution, about how you envision this, AI strategy. But I mean, the biggest consumers of I don't even know that, or the biggest consumers of AI manipulated images or information don't even know that in the first place what AI is. They don't even know that that is exactly what they were consuming. So it might sound like now that is participatory approach, but then even it still excludes quite a huge number of people that are quite unsuspecting of or what danger misuse of AI can become. So I think participatory approach means more than just asking people, to fill in a certain form. It goes beyond that. I believe it goes on to, having people, get explained to what exactly AI is, because that way they'll be able to recognize that, oh, this is something that has actually been affecting me. Actually, the ones who don't even have smartphones, those ones are the ones who are affected by AI the most, because one journalist is going to be misled by one AI manipulated image and is going to go onto a radio station without verifying or anything and mislead an entire village about something. Oh, I saw Trump shaking hands with so and so, and before you know it, the entire village is gone. So I think AI, rather participatory participation, a rather participatory approach does go way beyond that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to the panelists for the responses. And I like the note that we ended on, which is it's all about intention and intentionality. So you can't just say, you know, we're bringing the people in, so we are good, you know. You have to really intentionally, and even recognizing that there are intermediaries. I like the solution you offered, the intervention you offered, that once you know there are intermediaries who are going to be in the implementation of this system in how people receive services, then you'll design it with that in mind. And as all of you were speaking, I kept thinking, you know, the same way we take our laws from elsewhere and just paste them onto our systems, I think it's the same way we are doing with these DPIs, right? So just technologies that are, even the user interface, it just looks as every other one looks like from elsewhere, from wherever we import them, without really customizing it for the local context. Because I'm imagining that there's actually a way to design a system in a way that even someone who's not very literate, very digitally literate, can interact with it, especially as you know, you guys have said, just in the simplest way, just language, adopting their language and making sure that they can at least read what's on the screen, and then you know take them step by step. So with intention, you can achieve it. You can achieve Angela's utopia. Thank you to all the panelists for responding. And thank you to also the people who asked us questions, to Neema, Yvonne, and Annex. I see no other hands up, so I'll assume there's no other question. But if you have any questions, you can reach out through the IRA pages. I saw the coordinator, Adiboro, shared the LinkedIn page and also has shared the report for you to interact with and to read. Yeah, so assuming there's no other question and no other AOBs, I'll just give our panelists one final chance. You know, what's the one main thing that you want us to take away from this? So we have said a lot and there's a lot to consider, but if you want each of us to just go and do one question in our work, or you know, advocate for, champion one thing, what's that one thing that you want us to champion so that we achieve the utopia where DPIs are inclusive and they are citizen-centered? No order, just
I will go first. I think for me, the takeaway would be tech sovereignty first and people first, before you develop any DPI. Yeah.
Yes, I also think my biggest take again away from this will be again to solve issues of trust. We ought to always involve people first and not try to involve them later. You can't. In my high school, they used to call it postmortem, trying to know what exactly caused the issue when you could have perhaps done some risk analysis right from the start and seen who are you excluding, how can we best involve them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. So I think we need also to continue adopting, you know, an Afro-feminist perspective to this, where we are looking at the lived realities of African women and other underrepresented groups. At the center, you know, these women, it's critical that these systems are recognized, they protect and empower the women at the margin. The system should not ask the woman to adapt the structure that has not designed for. So that's my takeaway. Thank you.
thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the attendees for listening and also for your perspectives. So I see we are about 10 minutes past our time. Adeboro, thank you for having us, and I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you so much to the panelists. If you can use our emojis, react buttons to put our hands together, give all the flowers and all the love to the panelists. Thank you so much for such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. And thank you to the audience as well. Thank you to everyone who joined us today and interacted. I'm pretty sure that it was actually thought-provoking. It was for me as well, and I took lots of notes. I think that one of the key takeaways from this conversation is that while digital public infrastructure holds a lot of promise, for me, it kept ringing, access is not enough. Inclusion is much deeper. There are structural barriers, by affordability, gender, other realities that people actually face. And we also heard that, DPI, it's cross-cutting, right? There are data governance issues, power issues, rights issues, governance issues, right? So all of these things cross-cut and they come together, not just even for exclusion, but even down to surveillance and the shrinking of the civil space. We also learned that that the DPI systems need to be designed and adopted in context. For instance, the fantastic example of the informal intermediaries who have their benefits but also have their downsides. And so designing DPI adoption with this in mind would actually be an inclusive way to approach digital public infrastructure, sorry. And I think importantly, we emphasized all throughout the conversation that without deliberate and intentional attention to inclusion, it's just not going to be, the DPI systems are just not going to be quite useful, right? It will just reinforce the divide that already exists. So yeah, with that, I really encourage everyone to download, to read, to share the report. The report is extremely robust. There's an extremely robust literature review conducted by Policy. They even conducted, informant interviews, and you have 3 very solid country case studies, as Bonaventure has said, that you can dive deeper into it. You can read if you're from these countries, you can read, and if you're not, you can also do like a comparative analysis with your country to see what are the similarities and what are the differences. But again, thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. I look forward to further engagements with the panel, but also with the members of the people who have joined us today. Thank you and have a very lovely day ahead.